What's up, Hivers? 80s Saturday. Uh, you know, I know I'm only getting a couple of views on these music posts, but I have fun doing it. So I figured, what the heck? Let's keep it going. I don't even know what I talked about before the football season, the NFL, the American football season, because I used to have to do 2 posts a week for the weekly contests. And I'm trying to think, because these music posts, the reason I kind of say, oh, they only get a couple of views and I'm a little bummed about it is because I actually spend a lot of time listening to the music, which, is fun. So it's not work. But I actually think, I picked some pretty good tunes and know a good bit of history. So maybe I'll make a YouTube channel where I actually post these publicly. Right now, I only use YouTube as a hosting place. I put it unlisted, and you can only get it on Hive. I was putting only my music posts on Steemit just for the hell of it, but there's literally nobody there. It's all bots. Maybe in other regions, I know there's a lot of posts in Chinese. Maybe there's a real following there, but you click on basic words like 80s, music this, music that, and there's nothing there. It seems like it's all bots. I know there's some silver gold stacker people who post on both Hive and Steemit, which I think I just don't think we should be supporting the old fraudulent chain. We're on the real chain. Hive was an improvement. That's my personal opinion. And I see no reason to support Steemit in any way. I don't know. Maybe I'll post there once a year just to use some old Steam basic income units up. But it's a dead site. But yeah, maybe I'll make a YouTube channel with some kind of music name. Just because I am putting a lot of time into it. But hey, for the 3 or 4 people listening on Hive, today I'm going to talk about Joy Division, their 1980 record, which, was, I'm assuming was written and recorded in 1979. It's pretty wild how many bands just, you think of David Bowie coming out with an album like every 10 months in the most of the 70s. I guess you go to the 60s, the Beatles, and the amount of records they put out between 64 and 69 is pretty insane. I mean, like, an album every 7 to 9 month average. It's pretty wild. But yeah, David Bowie, it's pretty interesting. So I guess, not that it was the norm, but you look at the Cars, 79, 80. No, is it 78, 79? Excuse me. You look at the Police, 78, 79. Their 2 best albums came out year and next year. We're growing up. I think every other year was pretty much the norm. I'm just thinking of a random punk band because I was just, a couple of days ago doing my 90s Friday post for 1997. And a lot of bands, will go like 90, 92, 94, 96. You got the Beastie Boys who didn't give a crap about that. They waited until they had the best music possible. There's a lot of bands that can easily milk it and put out mediocre shit and still have a couple great songs on the album that could be singles and they could still sell millions of records. The Beastie Boys, 9 Inch Nails are probably the 2 best examples from the 90s who did not do that. I'd be tempted to say the Chili Peppers, but the reason they didn't put out as much is just because they were in a drugged out mess. And I think if they could have, they would have. But maybe you could put them in there, maybe. But it's interesting, like, you have these album runs of these great legendary artists, like 3 albums in 4 years. It's just wild. But anyway, Joy Division. I think these days, a lot of people have heard of them. I think they're one of those bands that kind of became legendary in underground scenes just because, well, the lead singer, Ian Curtis, committed suicide on May 18th, 1980. So I didn't realize it was that close to when this record came out. So this album came out at midnight, and it came out right before he passed away. Let me just double check the actual release date. But basically, he was 23 years old. Again, I was not even aware of that. So the album Closer, let's double check when it actually came out. Hold on. When, you can fast forward 20 seconds if you want. When did Joy Division's Closer come out? July 18th, 1980. So Ian had passed away already. I'm glad exactly 2 months prior. Exactly 2 months prior. I did not know that. So the lead singer had passed away already. Closer, it's the second and final album by the English rock band Joy Division, released 18th of July, 1980 by Factory Records, produced by Martin Hannett. It was released 2 months after the suicide of the band's lead singer and lyricist, Ian Curtis. So it kind of even brings my point more to the forefront. Basically, they only toured prior to their first album. And then, for a little bit after their first album. Their first album, Unknown Pleasures, you might know the cover. It's just black with like this white design in the middle. It's one of those t-shirts you see people wear that you assume probably half the people that own it don't even know what the band is. It's just become iconic, I think, because there's so many bands from the alternative scene in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s who really love these records. It's just super influential that I just think, there's, they've just become known, Let me just double check the date the other album come. Unknown. Okay, June 15th, 1979. So 1 year before Closer came out. That's the album I'm talking about today. June 15th. So I'm guessing they recorded their second album in like 2 weeks. I mean, it's amazing that, my main point of this is going to be what could have been and what I think would have been. So late, the 70s, you have the Ramones. In England, you have the Sex Pistols. You have Generation X with Billy Idol. You have bands like that. There were a lot of punk bands. You had bands like Susie and the Banshees who were playing around, the cities in England, mostly London. And Joy Division was one of those bands. They were called post-punk. I really consider it the beginning of, quote, alternative music. 1978, bands like The Cure, bands like Gary Newman's band, they were a punk band. And then he discovered the synthesizer and went full, people like Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails would say Gary Newman was like his biggest influence because he started mixing like electric, synthesizer sounds with, and just kind of starting this new thing. So Joy Division was with those bands. I know they played a lot of shows with the band Killing Joke, who's a band that would be considered post-punk, at least in the late 70s and 80s. They kind of went a little metal, kind of went a little weird, honestly, in the 90s and 2000s. But I remember hearing the lead singer of the Killing Joke talking about playing with Joy Division and how he said he really didn't like their live performance, but the records are amazing. That's true about a lot of bands. Papa Roach used to suck live, and they somehow got better. I don't know if they were all on drugs or what. Blink-182 was the worst live band I ever saw. When I saw them once before Travis joined the band, it was like my third concert ever. And their first drummer was just not very good. I know I'm picking very poppy examples, but some bands are just not as good live. It is what it is. But Joy Division, when I first tried to listen to them years ago, I didn't get it. And then just slowly, just hearing so many bands I like talking about how Joy Division's one of their favorite bands, They really were one of these bands in this post-punk kind of scene, kind of shared a space with kind of what became new wave. But, I can't help but, my opinion, and if you've never heard of them, you probably want to start with the first record. They also have a bunch of singles that were not on either of their only two albums. Love Will Tear Us Apart. That's, a well-known song these days. That was a single. That was actually not on either of their major label, their two big albums. Their two only albums, excuse me. And there's a few songs that have come out that sound a lot more punk rock that I'm assuming were, when they started, and they didn't make the first record. And it's just clear to me they're just one of the best bands of all time in terms of like alternative rock and roll music. And especially, being reminded of that literally both albums came out within, 13 months of each other. And they never toured for the second record because the lead singer was no longer with us. The impact that they've had on alternative music is mind-blowing. Because there are so many people who literally will call these two albums two of the most important albums of all time. Henry Rollins very strongly says that. He says Closer, the album that, came out in 1980, and that's why it's an 80s Saturday post. He says that's the album. But you got to go through the first album first because it's just so alternative and different. It's very clear why bands like Nirvana and just any alternative band, Trent Reznor, it's very clear why they cite Joy Division as such an influence. Now, what happened after the death of Ian Curtis, the band broke up. They pretty immediately started New Order, which had a bunch of hits. Blue Monday, how does it feel to treat me like you do? That song, Bizarre Love Triangle, which is like a pop song. The song Regret. They had a bunch of hits. I think most people know the song Blue Monday. How does it feel to treat me like you do? And to me, that song actually sounds like Joy Division. Most of the other ones are just very, very poppy and do not at all sound like Joy Division. It makes me wonder if that song in particular was an older song that they might have been working on or something. But my main point is this. I'm going to sample a few songs from the second album, Closer, below, because that's what I do on these 80s, on these music posts. But my main point is this. If Ian Curtis had not taken his life, and again, you could say this about anything, like if your favorite band's Nirvana, you're probably going to talk about, oh my gosh, their next album, it probably would have came out in early 95, like a year or so after Kurt's death. Man, if that didn't happen, their next album would have been, it probably would have been produced by Rick Rubin, and it probably would have sounded like this. It's all speculation. You know what I mean? It's total speculation. Maybe Nirvana would have broken up and never played again. And Kurt would have gone solo, and, maybe Nirvana wouldn't be as famed as they are today if they didn't go out on top, due to the death of their lead singer. So it is speculation. But seeing how a lot of these bands that were in this post-punk, that's what they call it, this post-punk scene in, the late 70s, very, very early 80s. I believe if Ian Curtis did not take his life, I believe, they would have had another album in 81 or 82. I think, Ian Curtis is a prime example of just being different. His voice is very strange and unique. And when you hear it, it doesn't really jump off the page like, oh, this will be a big hit. But I think the production would have gotten better. They would have tried different stuff. And I think Joy Division would have been one of the biggest bands of the 1980s. They're already there legendarily wise in terms of alternative music and just being so influential. But I think, they would have had an album out in 81, 83, 84, 85. And I think by then, just based on the talent of Ian Curtis, they probably, and the band did help write some of the music. So maybe they would have gone. I can't imagine Ian Curtis singing pop, straight up pop tunes. But there would have been some combination. And I think it's probably I think it's probably a bigger theft of what could have been than if we could hear, the next Nirvana record. Like if you gave me like a fantasy choice between the next Nirvana record in 1995 or what would have been the next Joy Division record in 1981 or 82, I would pick Joy Division. I'd be more if you could pick either Kurt Cobain or Ian Curtis, and say if you can only pick one for music fantasy reasons only, you can only pick one to live an extra 10 years. I think Joy Division, we would hear a band that is like as big as any other band from that scene. U2 kind of started from that scene. Obviously they changed a lot. You don't really think post-punk when you hear, 90s or 2000s U2. But they did come from that scene. The Cure came from that scene, and, obviously they're very melodic. But I think they probably commercially, they would have, I think they just would have been huge. But I think they also would have kept making pure music. And who knows, maybe they wouldn't have been huge commercially because it would have been too different. But I think they would have been on the radio. I think they would have been on MTV. You go back to bands like U2, their first two albums were very much a little more rockish. Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, you're listening to their early stuff. It just sounds like it's from this post-punk scene. And it's just very different. I'm trying to think of another example besides U2. There's just so many. I guess none of them are really, really monstrous huge. A lot of these bands, influenced, what came in the 90s, and then the 90s bands got huge commercially. That's kind of what always happens. It's like the first to come never get the full credit. Kind of like the Pixies, putting out 5 albums from 87 to 91, and Nirvana basically ripping them off and becoming huge with the same kind of sound. But I just personally believe that Joy Division would be the most cited. They're already hugely cited. But I think if we got 10 more years of albums, let's say 4 more albums, I honestly believe they would have just blown away. They would be the number one cited band from that scene. And I think there's a good chance, as different and weird as Ian, the lead singer, was, I think they would have met in the middle of what New Order kind of became. And with Ian's lyrical genius, I think they would have had monster hits, but kept their credibility and probably been the biggest alternative band ever. Literally less than a year after their first album is released, the lead singer passes away. And they're still this legendary to this day. I just think this album, 1980s Closer, again, if it's your first listen, you're probably going to be like, this sounds weird as fuck. But if you're coming from a place where, like, you love all these 90s alternative bands, you got to give it a few tries. but I think this is probably some of the best music ever made. And it's definitely the beginning of where like 90s alternative rock came from. You know, maybe a little bit of goth and that kind of stuff. And I just think it would have been super interesting to get a third, fourth, fifth album. I would definitely pick that over another Beatles record. I just think it's that special. And again, it's going to take you a few tries if you've never heard the band. It's going to sound just kind of weird because it's so artsy and different. But once it kind of clicks and you're like, okay, I see I get it. You'll hear it. It's I'm having real trouble trying to explain it honestly. But again, you probably want to start with the first album, Unknown Pleasures. But Closer, released 2 months after the lead singer's death in July 1980, is my 80s Saturday pick for today. I'll put a couple songs below. I'll even put a bonus jam or two from their previous stuff. But basically, my whole point is this should have been one of the biggest bands from the 80s that would have been successful commercially, but also not sold out. And we got a taste of it, a very, very great taste of it. But I think in another universe where Ian Curtis did not take his life May 18th, 1980, I think there's a universe where there's a montage of 4 or 5 albums as the cover to this post, and me picking 3 songs from like 5 different albums and calling it the most important band of the 1980s. Instead, we only got 1 record in 1980. Only 2 records overall. So my point basically is this is probably the greatest theft to not just alternative music, but up there with, John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, what's his name from The Doors? Oh my God, I'm having a brain freeze. Oh my gosh, I can't believe you know who I'm talking about. It's just the biggest theft ever. And even if it sounds kind of weird, and Jim Morrison, didn't even have to look it up. It finally came to me. I hope I'm not going the way of Joe Biden. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I think it's right up there at the very least. And if you haven't heard these records, check out both of them. And, if you don't get it, it just sounds weird. Revisit it a couple times. And just see. Just see if, it kind of clicks. Yeah, I'm having a real hard time trying to explain what I think it would have been. I just, you can't really discuss what you don't know. But I think this band, the follow-up records we never got would have been some of the most important albums in alternative rock history. And just would have been even more cited as one of the most influential bands of all time than they currently are. So check it out. Even if you don't get it, give it a listen. Maybe take a visit back in a year or two. And yeah, that's about it. I love you guys. Later.